Today we're going to be learning Pesachim Daf Kaf. Today's daf is sponsored by Carol Robinson and Arthur Gould in memory of Carol's father, Louis Robinson. Yehuda Lev ben Moshe Zichrono Livracha. Today, the first day of Hanukkah, we mark his 21st year at sight and miss him dearly. Lou is a devoted family man, an active participant in a synagogue. He could fix anything and most memorably rebuilt their kitchen cabinets and added new cabinets in a manner that any professional would be proud to claim as his own. He loved Carol and her sister Debbie and would be very proud of Carol studying Daf Yomi. Okay. We are going to start now the end of Daf Yutet. I'm just going to review a little bit of what we've done. What's really good about today's daf, I know people are not having an easy time with all these Tumantara pages. What's very nice about today's daf is that there's toward the end of the daf or the second side of the daf, there's a lot of review of things that we've done from the beginning of this Mishnah. So it would be a very good kind of sum up of certain things. I want to also thank all of those who've already joined the Circle of Friends. We've gotten a lot of good responses. I want to encourage everyone else who hasn't yet to please think about joining, giving some sort of contribution to Hadran to allow us to continue. Okay, now we're going to review. We had this Mishnah that we quoted again. How did we get to here? Because we started with Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim and a testimony he had about what happened in the temple. From here, we're going to move on to another testimony, another thing he testified about in the temple, which was this machat. We have a needle that as we're slaughtering, we find a needle in the middle of the animal. And we said the basal tameh, the meat of the animal is impure, but yadayim, any hands, or the kelim, right, the knife, is going to be tahol. So now the question becomes, what we tried to figure out yesterday is why? Why are the hands who touched it or the knife not, and why is the meat tameh? So now we said that there were a few possibilities. One was that it's suffix, right? And that there's a suffix we said about whether this knife, we thought maybe the para was a case where the para was muzzled. And clearly the knife came from outside Jerusalem and the needle. And the needles from outside Jerusalem are reason for concern that maybe they're tameh. And then, right, because it's muzzled, it didn't come from Jerusalem. Remember, we talked about the distinction that needles in Jerusalem, there's no doubt about them at all. And that's why basically the needle was a kli that became tameh from, let's say, a sheretz. So it's a rishon. Then it only passes on tumah to meat because a rishon doesn't pass on tumah to other things. Okay, that was one possibility. But the other possibility, which is the one we went in more in depth about, was that the needle was what we call a halal cherev. It's metal and it touched a tameh meat. That retains or gets the status of whatever it touched. So since it came in contact with the tameh meat, it was an av hatuma. Now, an av hatuma theoretically should be able to pass on impurity both to the meat and to the hands, or three, not just both, but and to the utensils. So the whole question became, why didn't it pass on to the others? And then to explain that, we had to say, look, the needle was in the meat. So it 100% touched the meat, and that's why the meat becomes impure. But we don't know if it touched the knife or the hands of the person. So therefore, we're going to be lenient there because if you remember, that was what Rav Ashi said. From here, we can infer that what? That the azara of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple courtyard or the area in the temple where they did the work, where they slaughtered the azara, that area we're going to say is Rishut Harabim. It's public. And what do we say about public space? Public spaces, Safek Tumah in a public space is going to be tahol. And that's why the meat definitely touched. That's why it's tameh. And if the knife and the person who definitely touched, they would also be tameh, but they didn't definitely touch and we don't know. Now the Gemara said, it sounds like if it was in a private domain, it would be. Remember, it would be a problem. But why? The knife shouldn't. Ein bodat lishael. You can't ask the knife what it thinks. And therefore, it's not similar to the sota. And it has to be similar to the sota woman in order for it to have tumah. So then we said, no, it's suffix tumah. I'm now we'll read from here, the second to last line of Yud Tet Amud Bet. Mishum dehave suffix tumah haba bidei adam. How did the knife get here? Well, a person was holding the knife. He slaughtered the animal. That came from the koch, as we say, the power of a person. A person was involved. If a person is involved, and that's what we're going to see right now, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, suffix tumah haba bidei adam. If it comes in the hands of a person, nish alina leha, that means you go to ask, it's a suffix, it's a real legitimate suffix. Afilu b'kli hamunach al gabei karka. What does it mean, afilu b'kli hamunach al gabei karka? Even if the utensil is on the ground, meaning even if the person didn't touch the utensil, let's say the knife, okay? What's our case? Our case is not al gabei karka. Our case is he picked up the knife, he slaughtered the animal with the knife. That clearly the hands of a human are involved. And therefore, again, that tells us, just to review, that tells us because of that, theoretically, if it were in Rishut Yachid, it would have been a suffix problem. But since it's in Rishut Rabim, and the Azara is considered Rishut Rabim, we're going to say Safek Tuma Rishut Rabim, right? It doesn't have the two criteria that you need. You need number one, Yesh Bodat Lishael, you can ask. Number two, it needs to be in a private domain, and this wasn't in a private domain. They have one, but not the other. What's the Kli Hamunach al Gabei Karka? Let's say the knife was on the ground, and the person was holding the needle, right? There's two items. There's the impure item, and then there's the question of did something come in contact with it? So our case was he was holding the knife, and the question is the knife tameh or not? Now they're saying even if the knife were on the ground, and let's say instead of holding the knife, the person were holding a needle, this is just a general thing about the tumah, then if there was a doubt about whether he touched the knife with the needle, even if the knife was on the ground, he wasn't even touching the knife, that still would be considered through the power of a person because the person was holding the tameh item, the impure item. So either which way, we treat that as there's a human involvement. Since there's human involvement in any part of the process or of the doubt, we're going to say that that would be considered a classic case of safek tuma. Then it all just depends, was it private or public? Okay. So now they say, Babasar tameh. Now we want to focus on the meat. So this explained, again, just to review, this explained the meat's tameh because it definitely came in contact with it. It's not a case of doubt. Did it touch the person or the knife? That's the question. And that we're going to rule leniently because it's in public. But now there's another problem with the meat. Hai basal de'it kasher b'mai. We've learned before that something has to become susceptible to impurity, meaning usually what it means, and we'll see today, maybe there's other ways. Usually what it means is a liquid has to get upon it. Now, why is that? It's not like the liquid does some hocus pocus and magically now it's going to be susceptible to impurity, but there's a logic to this. What does it mean? Let's say, okay, you go to a fruit store, you buy fruits and vegetables. You come home, what do? You wash them, or you pick your vegetables from the ground. They're full of dirt. You wouldn't eat them until you wash them. So washing makes it significant. It turns it into something important. So now the question becomes, what makes something huchshar lekabel tuma? Generally, we say that it's a liquid. So that's what they're going to say. What liquid came in contact with this meat? Okay, so again, we're on the third line of Kaf Amud Aleph. Hai basar de'it kasher b'mai. So going back to this case with the needle, touch the meat becomes impure, but no liquid came in contact with the meat, or what liquid came in contact with it? So we're going to have four possibilities. The first three are going to all be rejected. If you say it was the blood, oh, there's lots of blood there, right? We know that blood is one of the 7 liquids that can cause susceptibility to impurity. So if it's the it kasher b'dam, v'ham Rabbi Chia bar Abba amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, minayim l'dam kodashim she'eno machshir. The blood of sacrifices does not create susceptibility to impurity. How do we know this? Shene'amar. What does it say about blood in the Torah? And how do we learn that blood is one of the 7 liquids? Because according to the Torah, it's really only water. The question is, why are all the other ones considered like water? So what is dam? Lo tochlenu, you're not allowed to eat dam. This is the pasuk that tells you can't eat blood. Ala aretz tishbachenu kamayim. You have to spill the blood on the ground like water. That's the important word here. Because blood is considered like water, therefore it can create susceptibility to impurity. But what do we learn from here? Only dam that is like water. We've learned this before, very recently. Dam shenishpach kamayim machshir, v'sheino nishpach kamayim eno machshir. So which blood creates susceptibility to impurity? Only blood that gets spilled on the ground, like a regular animal you slaughter. That blood would create susceptibility to impurity because we just spill it on the ground. But blood of a sacrifice, what do? We collect it and we put it on the altar. That's not blood that gets spilled like water. Therefore, that blood does not create susceptibility to impurity. So option number 1, rejected. Option number 2, Ela de'itkasher b'mashke beit mitbachaya. Oh, remember we said there's liquids there. What are the liquids? Well, there's the blood. That we already rejected. But there's water. They would wash down the animals with water. So maybe it came in contact with water. V'hama Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. But wait, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said, remember the whole unique law about beit mitbachaya? Mashke beit mitbachaya, lo dayan shehem dachan. Not only are they pure themselves, but ela she'em machshirin. They also can't create susceptibility to impurity. So according to his opinion, for sure, it can't, right? It doesn't, it's not considered a liquid that creates susceptibility to impurity. And as they purify them entirely, not only are they pure, they also can't be treated as regular liquids to create susceptibility to impurity. So it's not that. Okay, option number 3. Ela de'itkasher b'chibat hakodesh. What does this mean? This is something that came up yesterday. I think I forgot to mention it by name, but the Mefarshim say it there. Yesterday, we talked about the Rabbi Akiva added the ktoret and the solet and all these things that aren't food, but yet when it came to tseruf, if things are in a bowl and it touches one, then all of them are considered tameh when it comes to sacrificial items. And he said even these items like the incense and the frankincense and the flour that they would use, those are considered. Why are they considered? They're not food. People don't eat them. So why are they considered that they get impure? It's because of what's called chibat hakodesh. What does this mean? And this is why I specifically started by telling you that susceptibility and impurity isn't only liquids getting on it. It could be that as long as something has significance, and now anything a sacrificial item is called because of chibat hakodesh, because we love the things that are sanctified, it has significance in and of itself. It doesn't need a liquid to come in contact with it. So perfect example are meat. Meat, it's sacrificial meat. You slaughter this in the temple for a sacrifice. It has significance. It doesn't need a liquid to come in contact with it because of chibat hakodesh. Chibat hakodesh gives it significance. So why are we going to reject this one? That sounds like a pretty convincing answer. So now they're going to say, wait. But nami. Wait, they say, I'm kind of stopping mid-sentence, but let me explain. When we say the chibat hakodesh causes an item to be disqualified. Now notice the word they used here. When we say chibat hakodesh, it means that if we want to say, can something become tameh? The answer is yes, it can become, but le'ifsule, what does that mean? Le'ifsule, remember we said pasul? Pasul means end game. That means this item becomes impure, but it can't necessarily pass on impurity. What they're trying to say is chibat hakodesh does create susceptibility to impurity, but not at the same level, or not necessarily at the same level as everything else. And how do we know that it's not so clear? Because what they're saying, let me read it again. When we said demahanya lechibat hakodesh, that it's effective to create susceptibility and impurity, it's just le'ifsule gufei. It's to make the item itself pasul, meaning the sacrificial item can no longer be brought. But lemimne be'rishon v'sheni nami. But is it also to say that it can then cause something to become a rishon and something else to become a sheni? Does it go further? And they say, if that were the case, tifsho to buy rish lakish tzarid shel menachot monim bo rishon v'sheni olo. If it were clear that that was the case, then we could have answered a question that Rish Lakish asked that clearly he didn't have an answer to, and therefore it must not be very clear that chibat hakodesh is enough to create rishon and sheni. Now, how do we know that the basar shenitma was a rishon, was something that could pass on impurity to something else? Okay, it would only pass on to a sheni because the meat would be a rishon. But how do we know that? Because it says in the Mishnah that we quoted, machat shenimtzei b'basar, hasakim v'yadayim torot, habasar tamei. It doesn't say habasar pasul, disqualified. It says it's tamei. Tamei seems to imply it's a rishon and can pass on impurity, or truth is it's a sheni, and can pass on impurity to something else, right? It's in the temple, so it could theoretically pass on impurity to another piece of sacrificial meat and make it a shlishi. So the fact that the Mishnah says tamei and it doesn't say pasul seems to say we can't use the answer of chibat hakodesh, because it seems from Rish Lakish's question that it's not clear how to treat chibat hakodesh. What is Rish Lakish's question? Sarit shel menachot, you ever make a challah dough and you didn't mix it very well, and you have a clump of flour in the middle of your dough? This used to happen when I was little. We made pancakes, and you end up with little clumps and they're actually delicious in the middle of the pancake, little clumps of flour. So that flour, if you're mixing minachot, okay, minachot or flour with water, and maybe some oil, you're mixing that and you end up with a clump of flour that no water, no liquid got onto it, no oil or no water. Now that's called the tsarit shel minachot. It's a chunk that has no liquid on it. Now, what did he ask? He asked, Monim bo lishon oshini olo. Can you say if this became impure, would it pass on impurity to the next level? And he didn't know the answer. So that seems clear. This is, again, a case of chibat hakodesh. It made it significant. So even though it was dry, it still became susceptible to impurity, but only that it disqualifies it, not that it can necessarily pass on to others. And therefore, we reject answer number 3. Finally, we get to answer number 4. Now, the difference between answer number 1, 2, and 3 is that it would be applicable in all cases. Blood is always found in a sacrifice. There's always liquids in the Beit Mikvachaya. And there's always chibata kodesh, right? That's just the nature of it. It's kodesh, sanctified. But this answer is a different answer. This answer would have to be that the particular Mishnah, when he described this case with the macha, with the needle, was in a particular situation. What was that? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, kigon shaita parash shel zivchei shlamim. It was a cow that was used for a shlamim sacrifice. I don't think that part's so important. Ve'evira banahal v'shachata. You passed it through a river and then you slaughtered it. In other words, while you were walking to the temple, it walked through a river. Now, if that's the case, what happened? When you slaughtered it, there was still some water from the river on the animal. And after you slaughtered it, that water dripped on the meat, and then the meat became susceptible to impurity, and then the machat touched it. So you'd have to say it was a case like that. And that's the only, and it's not a great answer because it would have to be only if it went through water. It's describing a particular situation, but that's what they say. Okay. Now we're back to another line, which I didn't really explain when we learned it. Nimtzeit beperesh hakol tahor. The end part of that Mishnah is if it came out in secretions from the animal. Okay, meaning now the needle, first we just thought you slaughtered it and the needle comes out and it's touching the meat, right? And then the question is, did the knife or the person touch it? But now it came out, a bunch of secretions came out of the animal's body, and in those secretions was this needle. Now, what's the difference? The difference is it doesn't directly touch the meat. So at this point, sorry, I see, Gita, you're asking the water dripped after it was slaughtered. I assume the water is dripping as it's being slaughtered. So as it's being slaughtered, the water drips on it, and it creates susceptibility to impurity. So now it's if it was in the secretions, hakol tahol. And that seems to be because it comes out with the secretions, it doesn't directly touch the meat. And we'll see other reasons about these secretions in a minute. So now they say, but I don't get it. V'nehader peresh v'nitmieh lebasar. If peresh, we're assuming right now that these secretions are liquids. If these secretions are liquids, what do we always say about liquids? Liquids pass on impurity, right? So nehader peresh v'nitmieh lebasar. We're assuming the peresh is touching the needle, right? Because the needle's inside this secretion. So the tuma goes through the needle to the liquid. The liquid now touches the meat because these secretions are coming out as you're slaughtering the animal, they're touching the basar. So why doesn't the liquids here, why don't these liquids pass on impurity to the meat? So Amar Adabar Ava beperesh ava. Oh, maybe these secretions aren't liquids. Maybe they're solids. If they're solids, you have a piece of peresh, solid. Now, the only reason we thought before peresh isn't food, right? Tuma would only be in foods. Secretions are not edible. But since it's a liquid, we say, oh, well, liquids pass impurity. Once it's solid, it's going to be solid. The needle's inside it. It doesn't touch the meat. And the peresh itself doesn't become impure. So that's one answer. Rav Ashi Amar, afilu tema beperesh raka, even if the secretions were liquidy, mishum dehave mashkes saruach. This goes back to something we said before. Remember that the saruach, it's disgusting liquid. Disgusting liquids don't pass on tuma. These are secretions from the animals. It's like kind of like excrement, right? So basically, that's why we're going to say the peresh doesn't make the meat tameh. Okay. I just see there's some questions. I want to quickly look. The shlamim passed through a river to be easy to slaughter. Oh, okay. It was passed through a river on purpose. That's interesting. Okay, fine. So now, Oh, I see. What you were asking, Gita, is about it's not an issue when it's alive. Obviously, when it's alive, the animal, the water that got on the animal when it was alive is irrelevant because remember, animals don't become impure when they're alive. It's just that we're assuming the water stayed on the animal all that time. So that once it got slaughtered, the water was still there, it was still dripping off, and that's when it dripped off after it was slaughtered. Okay, so just to make sure that that's clear. Now we're going to move on to another, okay, not a totally different topic, but we have a few different sections today. Tane Tana Kameh de Rav Sheshet. Somebody brings a Braita in front of Rav Sheshet, and here goes the Braita. Now we're going to read this Braita. You can look at the chart on the page. We're going to have 3 different versions of how this Braita reads, and it's going to again be good review for all our laws about Avatuma, Rishon Latuma, and how Tuma gets passed on. So now. Tane Tana Kameh de Rav Sheshet. Now, what often happens, and this is important, this is an Amora. Someone sitting in front of Rav Sheshet. There were people who were known to have memorized Braitot. He brings this Braita in front of Rav Sheshet, and then we're going to see there's a problem in the Braita. He must have gotten it wrong. And this is because they memorized them, and oftentimes there were mistakes. So he says the following. Sheretz mitameh tamashkin. Again, we're going to start with the sheretz, which is an av hatuma. It can be mitameh, a liquid. Then the liquid will become a rishon. Mashkin mitamim mitakli. The liquid can pass on impurity to a vessel. That would be a sheni. Already, if you think about it, right? That's already a red light. Why? We already said liquids don't pass on impurity to a vessel. However, if you recall, we saw Rabbi Yehuda, who had the opinion. He was one, again, I told you that today's daf will be a good review. Remember Rabbi Yehuda's opinion and all the thing about the liquids? And he said liquids are mitame everything. They can even pass on impurity by Torah law to a vessel. So this would have to be according to Rabbi Yehuda. But then remember, Rabbi Yehuda changed his mind and said they're not mitame vessels. So you'd have to say this is according to Rabbi Yehuda before he changed his mind, which is part of the weakness of this Braita. So the mashke can be mitame kli. The kli then becomes a sheni because we started with the sheretz, which was an av, went to the mashke, the liquid, which is a rishon. Next level, kli is a sheni. The kli mitame eta ochlim, which is a shlishi. Now, we're assuming we're talking about Tuma in general, which means we're not talking about Truma or Kodshim. We're talking about Chulin. Who does this match? That there's Shlishi for foods. That matches Rabbi Akiva. Remember, Rabbi Akiva said you can even have a Shlishi by regular food items. And then, 4th level, Ha'ochlim mitamim mitamashkin. That food can then go and make other liquids impure. Now, this is very problematic for 2 reasons. First reason is, nobody said, Rabbi Akiva said there's shlishi by chulin. He never said revi'i by chulin. So that's number 1 major question, which the Gemara doesn't ask, okay? Because the Gemara asks a different question. Before I ask the question, you have to read the end of the Braita, because the end of the Braita is going to be what the question the Gemara raises. So he finishes the Braita and he says, this teaches you, v'lamadnu shalosh tumot b'sheretz. You can see there's 3 levels from a sheretz. It goes 3 levels, from the av to the rishon, rishon to the sheni, sheni to shlishi, and shlishi to revi'i. Wait, I just counted 4, not 3. So that's the question the Gemara is going to ask. Even though they could have asked, why do you have revi'i by chulin? Never heard of such a thing. But instead they ask, the Braita itself doesn't make any sense because the Braita says that there's revi'i, right? That there's 3 levels and really there's only 4 here. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to say, Hane arba'ahen. These are 4. This isn't 3. So what are you talking about? So what do they answer? Guz mashkin dereisha. Obviously made a mistake. Let's take out the liquids in the beginning. Why would it make the most sense to take out the liquids in the beginning? Because I already told you there's a weird approach here, which is the liquids are mitame kli, which only Rabbi Yehuda holds. And if Rabbi Yehuda holds that, remember Rabbi Yehuda changed his mind. So it would be weird to have this in the Braita. So if that's the case, so look at my chart on the sheet if you have it. So sheretz is mitame a kli. That makes the sheretz makes the kli. We got rid of the mashke. So first stage, it's mitame a kli. The kli becomes a rishon. Then kli mitame eta ochlin. Now that kli goes and makes food impure. That's a sheni. Then the ochlin mitame eta mashkin. That's the 3rd level, and that makes it a shlishi. And again, you'd have to say it's Rabbi Akiva because no one else thinks there's shlishi by chulin. So that's one way of reading it. But now the Gemara says, Adrabah, why did you take out the mashkin in the beginning? Guz mashkin to seifa. Why don't you just take out the mashkin at the end and say, oh, the end was added? Because that's the 4th level. Let's get rid of the 4th level. We'll have sheretz to liquid, liquid to kli, kli to food. Why don't we just say that? So the obvious answer is lo eshkachan tana da amar mashkim mitamim kli ela Rabbi Yehuda v'hadarbe. That's because the only opinion that we ever saw of someone thinking that liquids can pass on impurity to a vessel was Rabbi Yehuda, and he himself changed his mind. And therefore, that's not a great way to read it. So we go back to the second version is the better version. V'simanech, and how do you remember this? This is kind of cute. Naziata. Naziata is beer. How do you make beer? First, you take a vessel, then you put the barley in, and then you pour the water on. So that's how you remember the 3 levels of tuma. There's vessel to food to water. Okay, nechmad. That's that next section. Now we have a new section. Tanan hatam. Now we're going to talk about tuma in a kli cheres. If you remember, we learned this a long time ago. If you have the kli cheres, they're going to talk about as an oven, an earthenware oven. If a sheretz comes into just the airspace, usually tuma is by touching. Normally you'd say if it touches the kli, so the kli is tameh. What if it just goes into the airspace? And from the airspace, right, just by going into the airspace of the kli, it makes the whole kli impure. So based on this, we're going to question, okay? Tanan hatam. Sheretz shenimtza b'tanur, hapat shebitocho shniya. Okay, again, it's describing levels of tuma. How does it work? A sheretz goes into the kli. The kli becomes a rishon, because remember, the sheretz is an av. The kli becomes a rishon. What happens to bread that's in that kli, right? Let's say a bread in your oven. So the bread becomes a sheni, okay? So, because the tanur is tchila, the tanur is a rishon. That's what it means tchila here. First, it means it's a rishon. Amalei Rav Ada bar Av ala Rava. But Rav Ada says, "V'nechze lahai tanur keman demale tumadamya v'tave had pat rishona." Why don't you say, since the sheretz, when it goes into the airspace of the kli, it's as if it's touching the sides of the kli, right? That's how it can make the kli tameh without even touching it. If that's the case, remember we saw the house is keman demalia dame. Sometimes we can view things as if they're full. So since the sheretz is metame through its airspace, why don't you just say that we view as if the sheretz is in the entire airspace of the inside of the kli? If that's the case, then it's as if the sheretz is touching the bread directly, even though it's not, but it's as if. So therefore, we'd say it makes the kli a rishon, and it also makes the bread a rishon. So why would you say the bread is a sheni? Why don't you call the bread a rishon? Because it's as if it's directly touching the sheretz, because it's as if the sheretz fills the whole airspace of the oven. So Amar le lo salkadata. I don't think that's the case, based on the following braita. Ditanya. Yachol yehu kol hakelim mitamim me'avir kli cheres. What if you have, forget about bread in the oven. Let's say you had another utensil in the oven. Would that utensil would okay, now, what's the question really? The question is, right, the sheretz passes on tuma to the kli, and then the kli would pass on impurity to another kli, right? Now that we say doesn't work. Talmud Lomar, how do we know the kelim that are inside another earthenware vessel don't become tameh? Now, let's just, before I even read this, if you'd say the kli was tameh, or let's say the reverse, let's go from the other way. If you'd say we view the whole utensil as if the sheretz fills up the whole space, then even if there's vessels inside there, those vessels will become impure. Because again, it's as if the sheretz is touching them directly. We understand that kli doesn't pass on to another kli, because that's what we learned, right? Kli can only pass on, a rishon can only pass on to food and drink, not to another vessel. But if we view the whole inside airspace as if the sheretz in it, and there's a vessel inside the vessel, well, then that vessel is as if it's direct contact with the sheretz, and it should be. And we're going to read from this braita that it doesn't become tameh. And how do we learn it doesn't become tameh? Talmud Lamal, kol asher b'tocho yitma. It said anything inside the kli will become tameh. And then what's the next verse? The samichle, right next to it, it says mikol ha'ochel asher ye'achel. From any food, meaning only food in the vessel becomes impure, but not anything else. So from here you learn that we don't view it as if the whole thing is full. And therefore, and that's why the bread only becomes a sheni. Okay. Now, I hope you're ready for the big review. Okay, here goes our big review of what we learned on already Daf Yud Daled. So let's go back to the Mishnah quickly, just to review, because it's important to understand this all well before we move on. Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim Omer. ממהן של כהנים לא נמנעו מלשרוף את הבשר שנטמע בבלד הטומאה עם הבשר שנטמע באב הטומאה, אף על פי שמוסיפים טומאה על טומאתו. You can't take, let's just explain it in one simple way, right? You can't take something that is rishon l'tumah and mix it and burn it with something, you can, my mistake. You can take something that's a rishon and burn it with something that's a shlishi, even though the shlishi is going to turn into a sheni. When you put it together, We don't care that you're afal pisha mosifim tuma al tumato, that you're basically adding to this already tameh item. We don't care because it's already tameh. Hosif Rabbi Akiva v'avar mimehem shel kohanim lo nimnu mila'lig et hashemen shenifsal b'tful yom b'ner shenitma b'tmei, which we explain to be the halal cherev, meaning that it's an avatuma with a shlishi, which even though it's going to jump it up 2 levels, you still can do it. Afal pisha mosifim tuma al tumato. Amar Rabbi Meir, midivrehem lamanu shesofrim tuma Torah ima tme'ah b'Pesach. Right? We had a bunch of different explanations whether he's referring to Rabbi Chanina or Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Akiva, or maybe to Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer, really Rabbi Yeshua, but saying you can learn that we can take Truma Tahora on Erev Pesach and burn it together with Truma that's Tameh, that's disqualified. Then Rabbi Yossi came and said, Ein nahi amidah, this is not true. Umodim Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yeshua, shesofin zolatzma v'zolatzma. They both agree that if you have pure truma, that's even though you have to burn it Erev Pesach because it's chametz, you cannot burn that with truma tme'ah, impure truma. The only case where they suggested one could do it, and only Rabbi Yeshua thought it was okay, was ala tluya v'ala tme'ah, if it's safek tameh. Remember that? This is the important line for our purposes, so pay close attention. If there's a doubt if something's tameh, then you're allowed to burn it with something that's definitely tameh. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Tisaref zolatzma v'zolatzma, he doesn't allow this, but Rabbi Yeshua Omer shtehen ke'echat. He says both can be burnt together. So now what we're going to have, our structure is very simple. We're going to have, and it's kind of like another kind of mnemonic like we had before. We're going to have Rav Chisda Rame, Pischa, Pischa. He's going to bring a contradiction between a case about Pesach, burning the chametz, and another case about Pesach. Then we're going to have Pischa Truma. Someone else brings a contradiction between our Mishnah about Pesach with a different Mishnah about Truma, which is going to be a review of cases we saw of Truma before. And the last one's going to be Rami Truma a Truma. They're going to take that case we just learned about Truma, and we're going to contradict that. We're going to say it contradicts a different source about Truma, and they're all dealing with the approach of Rabbi Yeshua to all these things. Okay, and I charted them all out on the sheet. That should help you. Rav Chisda Rami Pischa Pischa Umashani. He brought a contradiction between Pesach, and he resolved it. So let's see what the contradiction is. Let's see how he resolves it. Mi amar Rabbi Yeshua shtehen ke'echat. Does Rabbi Yeshua really hold that you can burn the truma that's safek truma, the tluya, with the tehora, with the tme'ah? Can you burn safek truma with definitely truma? Right? There's doubt whether it's truma or not. You can burn it with a definite truma. Uriminu. That's from our Mishnah. It said shtehen ke'echat. You can burn those two together. That was the machloka between him and Rabbi Eliezer. But this seems to contradict another source. Amar Rabbi Yossi. Now remember, Rabbi Yossi is also the person who brought up Rabbi Yeshua in our Mishnah. So now we're going to bring another contradiction to what Rabbi Yossi says somewhere else. The proof is not, the item you're trying to compare is not the same as the proof. When our rabbis don't learn to the Truma Tahora case, because Amahi Idu, what were they talking about? Not something that's pure and good with something that's bad. They were talking about, and this brings us back to Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, right? Something that's a shlishi together with something that's a rishon. Zetame v'zetame. But there, why did he allow it? Because both are impure. Again, this is just pure review. This is, right? They're both impure. They're both bad already. So what if you're making it worse? It's already disqualified, or it's already tameh. Again, avatuma with a shlishi latuma. So zeh pasul v'zeh tameh. The shlishi is disqualified already, and the other one is tameh. That's why. Af anu modim, we would then agree the truma shenitmeit bevlada tuma, shesofrino ta'ima truma shenitmeit ba'avatuma. So we would agree that if it's truma that was disqualified, or that was tameh, it was nitmeit bevlada tuma. Let's say it's only a rishon. We would allow that to be burnt with truma shenitmeit ba'avatuma. Okay, sorry, truma shenitmeit bevlad. Sorry, a shlishi with a shame, with a rishon. Aval he'ach nisrof afilu tluya im atme'ah. Shema yavo Eliyahu v'yitarem. But what does he say? But nobody in their right mind, now this is why it's important, he thinks nobody, not even Rabbi Yeshua, would say that something, those are definite tames. But things that are safek tuma, right, there it's definite tameh, but different levels. That I don't care. Of course you can do it. But if it's safek tuma, we're not sure if it's tameh. How could we possibly allow that to be burnt with something that's tameh? Shema yavo Eliyahu v'tarem. Maybe Eliyahu will come along and he'll say hey, you were wrong about that. It's not tamei at all, or you didn't have to worry, right? We didn't know if it was. It's suffix. We're not sure. When Eliyahu comes, right, he's always the one who kind of explains to us all the things we don't know. So if he comes and tells us it's actually pure, well, then it ended up we burned pure with impure. Now, seems very clear that Rabbi Yossi thinks not even Rabbi Yeshua would agree. So in our Mishnah, he says Rabbi Yeshua thinks you can burn Tluya with Tme'ah. So how could he say in this one, not? So what's the answer? Mishane ha Rabbi Shimon v'aliba de Rabbi Yeshua, ha Rabbi Yossi v'aliba de Rabbi Yeshua. We're going to show there's a machloket Rabbi Shimon, what he thought Rabbi Yeshua held, and a machloket about Rabbi Yossi, what he thought Rabbi Yeshua held. You can already see from the language in the Mishnah, when someone says, what were they arguing about? It's not about this, it's about that. You can already tell that there might be disagreements about what exactly their argument was about, because he's trying to tell you, I know they were arguing about this, not about that. But that seems like maybe someone else thinks it was otherwise. And what we're going to say is our Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon's approach, and this other source we just quoted is Rabbi Yossi's approach. Now, I already told you our Mishnah said in the name of Rabbi Yossi, so we're going to have to get back to that. Leave that as a question on the side. We'll have to resolve that later. How do we know? First, we want to know, we can't just make this up that, oh, Rabbi Shimon has a different approach. We're now going to bring a braita that shows that Rabbi Shimon disagrees with Rabbi Yossi exactly on this topic. Titania, we're actually going to see a three-way machloket. Yud Daled shechali yot b'Shabbat. In the following braita, it says, if Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat, like this year, mevarin et hakol milifnei Shabbat, you burn everything before Shabbat. Visorfin, and what do you burn? According to Rabbi Meir, trumot, tmeot, tluyot, utorot. You can burn all the truma together. That's Rabbi Meir in our Mishnah, right? Midivrehem lamanu, that even truma tahora can be burnt together with truma tme'ah. Rabbi Yossi Omer, but that wasn't what we're interested in right now. We're interested in Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon understanding Rabbi Yeshua's opinion. So Rabbi Yossi Omer, Torah b'fnei atzma, utluya b'fnei atzma, utme'ah b'fnei atzma. Rabbi Yossi says everything's separate. Nothing can be mixed together, which matches what he says in that other source we just quoted, that braita. Amar Rabbi Shimon, and here we wanted to see Rabbi Shimon's opinion. He says, Lo nechleku Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua. Now, by the way, you're going to see that what Rabbi Shimon says matches word for word what it says in our Mishnah in the name of Rabbi Yossi. Okay, and that's why it makes sense to say that Rabbi Shimon must be the one talking in our Mishnah. Well, we'll see, but it's Rabbi Shimon's opinion anyway. Rabbi Shimon says, Lo nechleku Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua ala Torah va'ala tme'ah she'en sorfin. They both agree if it's pure and impure, it's your chametz on Pesach, which is good truma. It's just you can't eat it anymore. That can't be burned with tme'ah for sure. He disagrees with Rabbi Meir about that. Ala tluya va'ala Torah shesorfin. If you have suffix with pure truma, that for sure you can burn together. Alman, no, we haven't talked about that case at all yet. Alman nechleku, but what's the machloket? Ala tluya va'ala tme'ah. The machloket is by chametz that we're not sure about its status with impure. That Rabbi Eliezer Omer tisaref zo batzma v'zo batzma, Rabbi Yeshua Omer shtein kechat. That's exactly our Mishnah. Okay, so based on this, we say our Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon, the Braita is Rabbi Yossi. But now the Gemara asked the question which I mentioned before, Bahamat nitim Rabbi Yossi, but our Mishnah is said in the name of Rabbi Yossi. How could you say it's not Rabbi Yossi? And then we really do have a contradiction, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi. So they say, oh no, this is the way you should read Rabbi Yossi. Hachi kamar in our Mishnah. Hachi kamar Rabbi Yossi le Rabbi Meir. Remember, Rabbi Meir said you can burn pure, good, perfect truma chametz with impure chametz. Why? With impure truma. Why? Because anyway, you have to burn it. We can burn it all together. It doesn't really matter. Comes Rabbi Yossi. He says to Rabbi Meir, Afilu Rabbi Shimon, va'aliba de Rabbi Yeshua de Mekel. In other words, I think you're totally wrong. I think what I think in what I said in the Braita. You can't burn even tluya with. You can't burn tluya with. I think no one thinks that you could burn tluya with tme'ah. Okay, forget about perfectly good chametz, right? Truma chametz. But even Rabbi Shimon, who's more lenient, va'aliba de Rabbi Yeshua de Mekel. In other words, Rabbi Shimon, who thinks that according to Rabbi Yeshua, you can be lenient in what? In safek tuma with vadai tuma. Ki Mekel betluya utmea, aval betahora utmea lo. He basically says to him like this: I think you can't burn anything. Only 100% tameh can be burnt with 100% tameh. You want to go to the other extreme and say you can burn chametz, truma chametz that has no impurity whatsoever together with tameh. So I for sure don't agree with you. And even if you want to go by the more lenient opinion than me, which is Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Shimon, which is Rabbi Yoshua, according to Rabbi Shimon's opinion, where he thinks that Rabbi Yoshua allows Safek Tuma with Vadai Tuma, that's only if it's Safek Tameh, but he wouldn't go so far as to say if it's totally pure and just that it's Chametz B'Pesach, and because of that, you have to burn it. So basically he's saying, he's bringing in Rabbi Shimon's reading of Rabbi Yoshua and saying, even if you want to be lenient like that, no can do. Okay, because he's still not talking about the situation that you're talking about. And that resolves our issue. Okay, next. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, second contradiction. Rami Truma Apischa. He's now going to bring a contradiction from Truma to our Mishnah about Pesach. Again, our Mishnah being the same thing, that Rabbi Yoshua says you can burn Tluya Safek Tuma with Vadai Tuma. Umashane, and he brings a resolution. So here's his question. And this is good review because we're going to review all the Truma cases that we saw before. Mi amar Rabbi Yoshua shtehen ke'echad. Did he really say you can burn Safek with Vadai? Uriminu, that contradicts the following source. Chavit shel truma shenola b'safek tuma. You walked into a room, we're not sure if you were tamei, we're not sure if you touched the barrel of wine or not. Rabbi Eliezer homer, imay tamunacha b'makom hatorfa yinichenu b'makom hamutzna. Imay tamugula yichasena. Rabbi Eliezer says this is still only a doubt. We still have to treat it as if maybe it's good truma, and if it wasn't protected, you have to protect it. If it was uncovered, you have to cover it. Rabbi Yoshua omer, imay tamunacha, and this is the important part because we're dealing with Rabbi Yoshua. If it was hidden, I don't care if you put it in a place that's not hidden anymore. If it was covered, you can uncover it. Now, what do you learn from here? Safek Tuma, we're lenient about. However, in what way are we lenient? That you don't have to protect it anymore. But it doesn't say you can make it tameh. And our Mishnah says you can burn them together. By burning them together, you're making it tameh. So those are two different things. So why does he say there you can't do it directly? And by our Mishnah, he says you could do it directly. Umishane, again, what do they explain? Ha Rabbi Shimon aliba to Rabbi Yoshua, ha Rabbi Yossi aliba to Rabbi Yoshua. Again, we say, where he's not lenient, he says you have to do it indirectly only. That's Rabbi Yossi, who thinks that Rabbi Yehoshua wouldn't allow you to burn it. And our Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon. Okay, same answer we gave before. Rabbi Elazar Rami Truma a Truma. Now we're going to bring the last contradiction, Truma to Truma. Umashane, and then he resolved it. Mi amar Rabbi Yoshua grama imbi adayim lo. So now we're starting where we ended in the last one. So according to the Mishnah in Truma, what did we see? If you do it indirectly, it's okay, but you can't directly cause something to become tameh. Uriminu, and this contradicts the other source that we saw. Chavit shel truma shenishbera begata elyona. Remember, we had it in the upper wine press, and it breaks. V'tachteh chulin, and now it's dripping down into chulin tmein, and the truma is going to become tameh. It's basically going to be a loss. Modet Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Yoshua shim yachol latzil mimena revi'i petara yatzil v'im lav. Rabbi Eliezer omer terei v'titma v'al yitamena biyad. Rabbi Yoshua omer yitamena biyad. So they say that if you have a vessel that can hold a revi'it, that's already important. Take a pure vessel, take out a revi'it of wine, and we don't really care about the rest of it. You've already saved something important. But if you can't, then we allow you to take tamei kelim and with your own hands. Again, this goes against what we said. You can't do it directly. Directly, you could take something tamei, put the wine into the tamei kli, and make that wine impure. Okay? So why do we allow it there, but we don't allow it in the other case? The other case, we only say indirect, right? And Rabbi Eliezer doesn't hold you can do it directly, but Rabbi Yoshua says you can. Umishane, so the answer, what's the answer to this contradiction? Shane hatam diika hefsed chulin. That's different because there it's going to mess up the chulin and destroy them, right? Now this chulin is going to be tameh. The only thing you're going to be able to do is to burn it. What are you going to do with burning oil, right? There's nothing you can do with it. You can't benefit from it anymore. It's truma. So you can only, right? The only thing you can benefit, you can't eat truma tahora. You can get benefit from it, which we'll talk about soon what that is. So matkefla rava. But wait, matnitinami ika hefsed eitzim. In our Mishnah also, right? In Pesachim, there's also a hefsed. This is a pure repeat of the sugya we saw. So, and there we don't allow you to burn the truma with the tahora, even though we'd rather minimize, right? When you have safek tuma with vadai tuma, we say you can't burn them, right? Even though there's going to be hefsed eitzim. So, amar le'abaye lehefsed meruba chashashu, or your truma tahora, you can't burn together. Lehefsed meruba chashashu, lehefsed muat lo chashashu. There's a difference between losing a whole barrel of wine to wasting some twigs. How do we know that we're not worried about hefsed mu'at, but we are hefsed meruba? Tanya, Chavit shel shemen. Now we're going to have the same case, but instead of wine, it's oil. Now, oil is not going to be a big loss. Why not? Because what did I say? You could do a truma. You can benefit from the burnt from it once it's ruined. You just can't eat it. So what would you do? You burn the oil, and that makes light, right? Fire. Fire is good. You can benefit from it. So it won't be a loss if you have to burn all those chulin now, which now became truma that got nitzmeik because it was mixed up with chulin that were tmeim. We don't care because you can use it. And that's why this case, you're going to see a difference in the halacha here. Chavit shel shemen truma shenishbara begata el yonah b'tachtona chulin tmein. So same exact situation. It's dripping down out into the chulin that are impure. Moder Rabbi Eliezer l'Rabbi Yoshua shem yachol latzil mimenu revi'i b'tara yatzil. So far, that's the same, right? You can take out a revi'i. Great, do that. If you have a pure kli, v'im lav, everybody agrees. Now, there's no machloket. Terei v'titma va'al yitamena b'yad. Even Rabbi Yoshua doesn't allow you to cause tuma directly. And why is that? Because it's a hefsei mu'at. Why is it hefsei mu'at? Well, so now the Gemara says, wait a minute. Ma'ishna shemen deroy lahalik, right? It's because you can light a fire with it. Yayinami ra'oy leziluf. You can scatter the wine, which basically will be absorbed in the ground. So it'll go to waste, which will be okay. But you'll gain benefit from the smell of it. So wine also has a use. So why would you say it's not such a big hefsed? If I end up with all this wine, I'll use it for ziluf, for making a nice smell in my house. The chitem is ziluf lav milti. Now maybe you'll say ziluf is not really so significant. Okay, this shows that they would use more expensive wine for ziluf. That shows it obviously has significance. So they say maybe bechadash, it's new wine. New wine doesn't have a smell yet. V'hara oili yashno, you could always leave it. These are just keep one question. Every time we answer, we're going to ask a question on it. But you can leave it to age. And as it ages, then you'll be able to use it. So again, it's not a big loss because, so maybe you can't use it tomorrow, but you could use it in a year or two. But wait, if you leave your wine for a long time, it might end up, you'll forget that it's truma tme'ah and you'll actually drink the wine. So they say, well, then you should have the same problem with the oil. Shemenami atibeli de takala. The oil that you're leaving for lighting, maybe you'll also forget about it and you'll use it for eating. So they say, no, you put the oil in a disgusting utensil and everyone knows it's just meant for lighting and not for eating. So they say, so why don't you just do the same thing with the wine? Yayinami, rami lebekli ma'us. So what do they say? Obvious answer. Leziluf kabai lebekli ma'us. What you want it leziluf kabai, and you're gonna put it bekli ma'us. In other words, you wouldn't, if you're using it for a nice smell, you wouldn't put it in a disgusting utensil. So therefore, basically, we're gonna say, sorry, I didn't read it the whole thing. Bekli ma'us ramile, you're gonna stick it in a disgusting kli? Of course not. Okay, I'm gonna end here for today because we've gone on a little long. But I just want to introduce the next section, which is they're now going to say the fact that this was all to prove where yayin, Rabbi Yeshua allows you to be matame biyadayim in order to prevent the loss of the wine, because the loss of wine is a big loss, whereas the loss of oil is not a big loss, and that's why he doesn't allow it in the oil case. And that's because the oil can be used immediately, and the wine can maybe only, if it's new wine, it can only be used much later, and we're worried you're going to maybe use it and make a mistake. So now the Gemara says, Takala atzma tenayi. They're now going to prove that whether or not we're worried that you might accidentally eat it, okay, this goes back to the whole thing about human error. What will people make mistakes about? So if that's the case, it's going to say that whole issue is a machloket tanaim. Not everybody agrees that that's the reason for concern, that maybe people will accidentally use it or if they leave it over time. Okay, that whole thing is a Tanaitic debate. We'll end here for today. And as I promised, just a little bit more of this, and then already tomorrow, we have a much simpler daf and back to Pesachim issues. So Chanukah Sameach to everyone, and Shabbat Shalom.